A dramatic birth. As soon as the baby was born, he said something which made the doctor unable to believe it and run away immediately, leaving the whole delivery room stunned. What did he say? Please join me in following the story to find the answer. One afternoon, Emily's hands trembled as she stood over the kitchen sink, the rhythm of dishwashing lost as her thoughts drifted into the usual fog of worry she had been feeling off for days, but had brushed it off as the exhaustion of late pregnancy. Suddenly, a dizzy spell swept over her like a strong tide, pulling her under. She gripped the edge of the sink, waiting for it to subside, but instead a sharp, unbearable pain shot through her lower abdomen. Her hand instinctively flew to her swollen belly. No, this couldn't be happening. She was only 7 months along. It was far too soon. The contractions were real, though, gripping her in a way she couldn't deny. She needed help fast. Her heart raced as she staggered toward the kitchen table where her phone lay. Each step felt like wading through thick mud. Her mind muddled by fear and pain, her vision blurred, but she managed to swipe the screen, dialing for a cab. In sheer desperation, the minutes stretched endlessly until finally she heard the honk outside. She stumbled to the front door, clutching her stomach, barely able to stand upright. The cab driver, a burly man with a kind face, rushed over to help her. Mom, are you all right? His voice was heavy with concern, his hands gentle as he guided her to the backseat. Hospital. Please hurry, she gasped, her voice strained and shaky. The driver didn't hesitate, slamming the door and bolting for the driver's seat. His foot hit the gas hard and Emily squeezed her eyes shut. Each jolt of the car sending another wave of pain coursing through her body. The cab sped through the streets, but for Emily time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as the world around her spun. The contractions were getting closer together, and the fear settled in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Was the baby going to be okay? Was she going to be okay? When they reached the hospital, the driver jumped out and flagged down a nurse at the entrance. Emily was barely conscious as she was wheeled inside. Her surroundings are a blur of white coats and flashing lights. You're going to be all right, Ma, Emma nurse assured her, though the words barely registered. The door to the delivery room swung open, and there stood Dr. Clark, a tall, composed man in his mid-40s, his expression calm. Despite the chaos around him, he moved swiftly, assessing her condition with a practiced eye. She's only 7 months, a nurse informed him. Dr. Clark's face tightened, but he didn't let it show. Sheck, not dilated enough. We can't wait, he said, his voice firm. We'll have to do an emergency C-section. Emily's head was spinning, her thoughts scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the words wouldn't come. She felt like she was drowning, the world around her fading in and out as the pain took over. Emily heard the clatter of metal and the low murmur of voices, but it all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Dr. Clark stepped out to scrub his hands, following protocol, his steady presence offering a sliver of reassurance in the chaos. Emily lay back, her eyes fluttering closed as exhaustion and fear tangled inside her. She wasn't ready. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen, but there was no stopping it now. The baby was coming. The minutes ticked by, and the nurses and assisting doctor waited anxiously. Dr. Clark hadn't returned. A nurse went to find him, but she came back empty-handed. I can't find him anywhere, she said, clearly worried. Just then the operating room door swung open, and a man entered, fully dressed in sterile surgical attire. His face was covered by a mask, and he didn't speak. Instead, he gestured to his throat, indicating he couldn't talk, as if he'd lost his voice. The assisting doctor, slightly confused, caught on quickly. At that moment, everyone assumed Dr. Clark was ready to begin the surgery. All eyes were on him, but something felt off. Instead of taking charge, the doctor made a series of hand motions to the assisting doctor, signaling for him to proceed. "You want me to handle this?" the assistant asked, perplexed. The doctor nodded silently. Although unusual, it wasn't unheard of for EL physicians to delegate more routine procedures to their assistants. Nervously, the assisting doctor accepted the responsibility and began the C-section under the watchful eye of the masked man. Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly until Emily, still semi-conscious, opened her eyes, and even though the doctor was masked, something about him seemed disturbingly familiar to her. Emily tried to scream, but all that escaped her lips was a muffled whimper. Her trembling hand pointed directly at the doctor as if trying to warn the others. The nurses rushed to calm her down, believing she was experiencing a panic attack. "Relax, everything's all right," one of them whispered soothingly, stroking her arm. But the doctor made another subtle gesture, this time toward the anesthesiologist, who hesitated before asking general anesthesia. The doctor nodded. Although it wasn't the usual procedure, the anesthesia enlist complied, and soon Emily drifted into a deep sleep. The medical team proceeded with the operation under the watchful eye of the strange doctor. Eventually the baby was delivered, and a wave of relief swept through the room when his cries echoed softly in the sterile air. The staff sighed in unison, and some even clapped lightly, their tension easing. The assisting doctor, smiling, handed the scissors to the lead surgeon to cut the umbilical cord. However, the man appeared clumsy, unsure. He eventually cut the cord, but something fell off as he lifted the newborn into his arms. The baby's cries abruptly stopped. The room, previously buzzing with activity, fell into an eerie silence. The infant, no longer crying, opened his eyes and locked his gaze onto the doctor's. For a few seconds the baby stared directly into the doctor's eyes. And then something unimaginable happened. In a barely audible tone, the baby spoke. It wasn't a babble or incoherent sound. It was a clear word, though no one else seemed to notice. The doctor heard it. Distinctly stunned, he broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" he asked, wide-eyed. Turning to the rest of the team, the nurses exchanged confused glances, unsure as of what he meant. "Did you hear what the baby said?" he repeated, his voice now shaking. The staff looked at him, baffled, not knowing how to respond. The doctor, growing increasingly agitated, clutched his head in disbelief, unable to process what he had just heard. It was obvious no one else had heard it. "Get him away from me," he suddenly shouted, panic lacing his voice, shattering the quiet of the operating room. At that moment his hands, once steady, began to tremble uncontrollably. Without warning, he released the baby, who fell gently onto Emily's chest. Still under the effects of the anesthesia, the room froze in shock, no one reacting fast enough. They stood there paralyzed as the doctor, without another word, turned and bolted from the operating room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Everyone remained in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The strange scene searing itself into their memories. The nurses quickly rushed to tend to the baby, who had resumed crying as soon as he landed on his mother's chest. None of them could make sense of what had just transpired, or why the doctor had fled so suddenly. One of the nurses, still in shock, muttered something wasn't right with that doctor. Since she came back from surgery, she had been acting strangely. I believe she thought the baby spoke to her. Those in the room exchanged bewildered glances. It didn't make sense. Newborns, especially one so recently delivered, cannot talk. Their neurological and physical development isn't advanced enough to form words. A newborn's brain hasn't developed the connections needed to process spoken language, and while their vocal cords are functional for crying, they aren't yet capable of producing words. Despite this knowledge, a sense of unease spread through the room. Some of the medical team held the baby, trying to soothe him, and even brought their ears close listening for any further sounds, but the baby just kept crying loudly as any newborn would. The room buzzed with murmurs until a sharp sound cut through the air. The vital sign monitors began beeping insistently. The patient's in crisis, one of the nurses shouted, rushing towards the machines. The assistant doctor, in the absence of the lead surgeon, quickly took charge. Inject 1 milligram of epinephrine. Now, he ordered, immediately asking for the defibrillator. Hurry, we're going to lose her. The room was thick with tension as the assistant doctor barked orders. It must be the general anesthesia we administered, shouted the anesthesiologist, visibly rattled. Stammered in his defense, I did only what the surgeon instructed. He was the one who ordered the general anesthesia, he said, his voice shaking as he watched the chaotic efforts to save the patient. Meanwhile, a nurse continued to hold the baby, keeping him away from the frantic scene unfolding around him. Though he was still crying, the baby seemed unaware of the desperate struggle to save his mother's life. Emily had been left shattered after losing her husband. Joshua, a successful attorney who ran his own law firm, had been her life partner. He had an assistant, a man named Leo, who had always been respectful, or so it seemed over time. However, Emily began to notice something unsettling. Every time she visited the office, Leo would look at her in a way that made her uncomfortable. At first she brushed it off, but one day when her husband wasn't around, Leo dared to confess his feelings. I've loved you in silence all this time, Emily, he said, moving in far too close. Before she could react, he grabbed her from behind, holding her tightly. Shocked and terrified, Emily barely managed to break free, slapping him across the face. Don't ever touch me again, she screamed, trembling. I love my husband, and besides, I'm carrying his child. If you come near me again, I'll tell him everything. Leo, his face flushed with rage, glared at her menacingly. You'll be mine sooner or later, he muttered under his breath before storming out. Emily almost told her husband about the incident, but when Leo acted normal in the days that followed, she decided to let it go. She wanted to forget what had happened. However, 3 months later, her world was struck by tragedy. The authorities contacted her with the kind of news no one ever wants to hear. Her husband had been killed in a car accident. In a state of shock, Emily went to identify her husband's body. Heartbroken, she noticed she had a voicemail from him left just before the accident. Her heart clenched at the sight of it, yet she couldn't bring herself to listen. The emptiness she felt was overwhelming, and just the thought of hearing his voice one last time left her paralyzed. Deep down, Emily believed her husband had tried to say goodbye, but she hadn't answered the call. That thought filled her with an unbearable guilt. The anguish of not speaking to him one final time haunted her, and the message, still untouched, loomed over her like a silent torment. As the investigation unfolded, she discovered that Leo had been driving the car. According to his account, he lost control and veered off the road, crashing into a tree. Leo managed to escape the burning vehicle, but Joshua, unconscious from the impact, was trapped and consumed by the flames. Emily's suspicion grew stronger. Had Leo caused the accident on purpose? She had no proof, just an insidious feeling gnawing at her soul. At the funeral, while Emily wept in solitude, Leo approached her again. Now you're free, he whispered, a twisted smile curling his lips. I still love you. Without thinking, Emily slapped him hard. I will never be yours. My son is the only man that matters in my life. Leo's face twitched with anger, his lips trembling, as he coldly replied, the only son you'll have will be mine. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. Fear gripped her in a way she had never experienced before. What if Leo had really caused her husband's death? If he had done it to claim her, perhaps he would now try to harm her son as well. The thought chilled her to the core. She felt that both her life and her sons could be in danger with that terrifying thought swirling in her mind. Emily made the decision to leave town. She rented a house in a remote area, settling there to await her child's birth, and peace. Money wasn't an issue. Her husband had left her a substantial sum in the bank, along with the life insurance payout she received after his death. With everything she needed, Emily resolved to spend the remainder of her pregnancy far away from Leo and the danger she felt closing in on her. The constant beeping of the monitors filled the delivery room, which had descended into chaos despite the frantic efforts of the medical team. Emily was declared clinically dead by the attending doctor. The general anesthesia had seemingly triggered an adverse reaction in her body, leading to cardiac arrest. The sadness and helplessness weighed on everyone present. They knew that the newborn boy had now lost both parents. His father before he was born, and now his mother with tears in her eyes. One of the nurses gently picked up the peacefully sleeping baby and placed him on his mother's chest, as if giving him a chance to say goodbye. In that moment, the baby began to wail loudly. The hearts of everyone in the room shattered as they watched him instinctively seek to nurse, unaware of the tragedy surrounding him. His cries continued until one of the nurses tried to lift him, but the tiny infant clung to his mother's body, his small hands refusing to let go. The scene was heart-wrenching. No one knew what to do. Finally, the attending doctor decided he would have to separate the baby himself, yet just as he was about to pick up the child, a shout stopped him in his tracks. "Doctor, look at the monitor," one of the nurses cried, alarmed. The heart monitor displayed a faint but undeniable pulse. Emily was breathing weakly, but she was breathing. It was nothing short of a miracle. "Quick, inject 1 milligram of epinephrine," the doctor commanded. Following protocol, slowly Emily's vital signs stabilized. The medical team was in disbelief. Cheers erupted as the room filled with applause, everyone hugging one another, overwhelmed by the miracle they had just witnessed. Emily, still recovering, slowly opened her eyes. She looked at her baby, held him tightly in her arms, and showered him with kisses before nursing him. The tender scene brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the room, moved by the sheer joy of the moment. But this happiness was shattered in an instant when Emily's eyes widened in terror, and with a voice filled with panic, she screamed, "Leo!" Everyone in the room froze, staring at her, confused and unsure of what she meant. A nurse stepped forward, cautiously trying to soothe her. "Emily, what's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily, still in a state of shock, cried out again, "Leo, you have to stop him. He's dangerous." Her voice was laced with desperation. Summing her strength, she began to explain, "That wasn't a doctor, it was Leo, my husband's former assistant. I know he was trying to hurt my child." The medical team exchanged uncertain glances, not knowing what to make of her words. Emily quickly told them her suspicions about Leo, her belief that he had been involved in her husband's accident, and her growing fear that he had returned to do harm. Just as she finished speaking, the doors to the operating room burst open. The real Dr. Clark stumbled inside, his face bruised and a large welt visible on his head. He was also wearing nothing but his underwear, which left everyone even more bewildered. "What happened to you?" one of the nurses gasped in horror. Clark, panting, struggled to catch his breath. "While I was washing my hands to return to surgery, a man in a hoodie came up to me. He said there was an emergency, that someone had collapsed on the stairs. He begged me to follow him, and I did, but when we got there, no one was around then. I felt a blow to the back of my head." Everyone in the room stood in stunned silence, barely able to process what they were hearing. Clark continued, his voice weak but determined. "I was half conscious, but I saw him strip off my scrubs and put them on himself. Then, when he pulled off his hood to put on a surgical mask, I Caught a glimpse of his face afterward. He dragged me down to the basement, tied me up, gagged me, and left me there until I managed to break free and get back here. Did he threaten you?" asked the nurse, his voice trembling. "Yes," Clark replied, shuddering at the memory. "He said he would kill me if I didn't tell him how to stop a newborn's heart." "The room," gasped Clark, hesitated before continuing. "At first I refused, but he beat me so badly that I had no choice. I told him he could do it with a glucose solution injection. Of course, it's harmless. It's just used to provide the body with energy in the form of glucose, completely safe, but he believed it was lethal for the baby." The nurses and the rest of the medical team exchanged glances, now understanding why Dr. Clark had been acting so strangely in the operating room earlier. It hadn't been him all along. It was Leo, the man who had clumsily cut the umbilical cord, had been the impostor. Quickly, they alerted the security guards and explained what had happened. One of the guards, after hearing Dr. Clark mention that the suspect had briefly exposed his face, became thoughtful. "If his face was seen, maybe the security cameras caught it," he said. And they all hurried to the monitoring station. Emily accompanied them in a wheelchair, holding her son in her lap. With Dr. Clark's assistance, they managed to pinpoint the exact location and precise moment when the man, for a fleeting second, pulled down his hood, revealing his face. As they reviewed the footage, Emily watched anxiously. Suddenly, she gasped, "It's him, Leo," she exclaimed, trembling from head to toe. On the screen, everyone could see how the impostor, disguised as a doctor, had tied Clark up in the basement. The video showed the man making his way to the medical supply room. He was rummaging through the shelves until he found what he was looking for: the glucose serum Dr. Clark had mentioned to deceive him. With a cold expression, he filled a syringe with the liquid and tucked it into the pocket of his coat. The footage continued. Leo, syringe concealed in his coat pocket, headed toward the operating room. Once inside, he waited for the moment when no one was paying much attention and discreetly pulled out the syringe. Then the video showed him cradling the little boy in his arms, seemingly ready to inject him with the serum. "Oh my God," whispered one of the assisting doctors, horrified by the scene. But just before he could go through with it, something unexpected happened in the video. Everyone watched as Leo suddenly froze. His eyes widened in shock, as if something had startled him. That was the moment he released the little boy, just as they had all witnessed in the operating room. "What stopped him?" one of the guards asked, puzzled. A nurse, her voice shaking, answered. "The impostor said he heard the little boy speak a word, and that's what scared him." The video had no audio, but everyone saw how the child stopped crying at that moment and stared directly at the supposed doctor. Then it appeared as though his lips moved, although no one could be certain if he had actually spoken a word. The scene was undeniably unsettling. They all glanced at each other, trying to figure out what the boy could have said if he had truly spoken. That would terrify a man like Leo. Someone so cold and without conscience, no one could make sense of it. The word that might have come from the boy's lips if it had remained a deep, unsolvable mystery. But Emily didn't care what the word might have been. With tears in her eyes, she hugged her son tightly, convinced that he had saved them. One of the nurses had told her that she had been clinically dead, and that, to everyone's astonishment, it was her son's cry and embrace that seemingly brought her back. "You're a hero, my love," Emily whispered, filled with infinite gratitude toward her son, who unknowingly had pulled her back from the brink. The security guards wasted no time in alerting the authorities about the incident, given how dangerous the suspect was, and believing he might still be nearby. The police launched a search operation across the area. It wasn't long before one of the patrol units radioed in, "We've spotted a man in a doctor's coat walking down the main avenue. It looks suspicious," one of the officers remarked. When they tried to stop him, the man, hearing them call out, bolted, running as fast as he could, without ever looking back. However, his escape was short-lived. The police quickly caught up with him, and he was apprehended shortly after. They sent a photo to the hospital, and both Emily and Drawer Clark recognized him instantly. "It's him," Emily gasped, her voice trembling. As they went through his belongings, they found the syringe filled with glucose serum in the pocket of his lab coat, the same one he had tried to use in the operating room. There was no doubt it was the same man who had attempted to harm her child. "The suspect is under arrest," one of the officers announced with a firm tone. Relief washed over everyone at the hospital, but none more than Emily, who let out a long, shaky breath, cradling her baby in her arms. At last the danger was over, and she felt safe with her little hero by her side. Days passed, and Emily cherished every moment with her baby, his wide eyes full of wonder. As he giggled in her arms, she lifted him up, kissing his belly, which made him burst into fits of laughter. In those moments she found a glimmer of peace she so desperately needed, but deep down the questions still lingered in her heart. Finally she gathered the courage to listen to her husband's last message, the one she had received just before the accident. For weeks she had avoided it, afraid of the pain that would come with hearing Joshua's voice one final time, but today she decided it was time. She glanced at the timestamp on the message, 3 in the afternoon, the exact time the police had said the accident occurred. Emily wanted her son to hear his father's voice too, so she put the message on speaker. "It's important he hears his dad," she whispered to herself, though her heart pounded in her chest. She pressed play, and Joshua's voice filled the room. At first, it was a comfort to hear him, but her relief was short-lived. Terror gripped her as the message continued. "Leo, what are you doing?" Joshua's voice was frantic. "You're crazy, we're going to die." Then Leo's voice cut through, cold and calculated. "That's exactly what I want, to kill you. Don't worry about Emily. Once you're dead, she'll be mine, and as for your son, I'll get rid of him too." Emily's world crumbled around her, the sounds of a struggle followed by her husband's agonizing screams filled the air. Then the crashed tears streamed down her face as she listened, unable to stop the flood of emotions. Her worst fears were confirmed. Leo had caused her husband's death, and he had done it on purpose. She now had the proof she had dreaded finding, with her baby still in her arms and the phone gripped tightly in her hand. Emily rushed to the police station. Once there, she recounted everything that had happened. The officers listened to the recording and concluded that Joshua had dialed her number just before Leo caused the crash. It was clear that Leo had been unaware the call was still connected, which captured their entire conversation and his sinister plan. With this evidence, the police had everything they needed to ensure Leo would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Emily, with her little one cradled in her arms, wept. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they weren't from sorrow, they were from relief. At last she knew the truth, yet that relief quickly morphed into a simmering rage. Unable to stop herself, she stormed toward the cell block. No one noticed her as she slipped down the hallway. There he was, lying on a cot. Emily's restraint broke. "Leo," she screamed, her voice trembling with fury, "I have proof that you killed my husband. You'll rot in this cell for the rest of your miserable life." Leo jumped to his feet at the sound of her voice, ready to hurl insults back at her, but then his eyes landed on the small child in her arms. In that instant something shifted in him, his face drained of color, his expression twisted, and with wide, terrified eyes he began to shout, "Get him out, get him out of here," he screamed, trying to cover his ears. Emily stood frozen, watching as her little one stared intently at Leo, and in that moment she thought she heard something. A lump formed in her throat, as she could have sworn her child spoke a single clear word murderer, Emily's blood ran cold. Leo, meanwhile, writhed in fear, screaming as if the boy was some sort of nightmare brought to life. The guards rushed in, pulling Emily and her son from the cell. As they left, Emily couldn't shake the question from her mind. Had she really heard that word? Or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? But in the end, it didn't matter. She felt a deep sense of peace cradling her child in her arms, a child who would grow up surrounded by her unwavering love and strength. What a powerful story, right? Emily's journey through fear and uncertainty really reminds us how unpredictable life can be and how strength comes through in the most challenging moments. If you found yourself holding your breath, just like I did, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. And hey, if you're not already subscribed, make sure to do that now so you won't miss more emotional and gripping stories like this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time, and may God bless you all.